modern railroading. It's come a long way from the romantic days of the little steam iron horse. By comparison, this spacious cab on the BC Rail Line in British Columbia is the virtual lap of luxury, complete with a coffee maker to help the engineer and the fireman pass the long hours going down the endless miles of steel track.
So we don't have anything on the DOB to bother us today, Chris, eh? No?
While railroading has been romanticized in folk ballads and more recently by rail fans, fact is that railroads have always been used for purposes of industry, commerce, and transportation. Why, even the Army has a railroad. Today, the big diesels, like this triple CSX unit, can pull over 100 coal gondolas as seen here in West Virginia on the old chassis system. But it really wasn't all that long ago that old diesels like this one from the Baltimore and Ohio were introduced as the modern trains of the 50s and early 60s. But while these old diesels bore such modernistic names as Streamliner, they still stood in the long shadow of their predecessors, the steam-powered locomotive. Now there were the true giants on the rails. For the next 60 minutes, you're going to witness the largest operating steam-powered locomotives in the USA. From the high country in Cheyenne, Wyoming, comes the pride of the mighty Union Pacific Railroad. She's the largest operating locomotive in the world, 3985. This is the UP Challenger. From the Pacific Northwest, this is Portland, Oregon's Freedom Train from America's bicentennial celebration in 1976. It was once known as the most beautiful train in the world. Restored and maintained by friends of the 4449, this is the Venerable Daylight. From Indiana, the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society Superheated Burke. Left over from the famous Nickel Plate Road, this is the 765, rebadged to run up the old chassis system on the new River Gorge. From Shakytown, the city by the bay, comes a locomotive fully restored by San Francisco's Golden Gate Railway Museum. Here comes SP 2472. From the copper country of Ely, Nevada, comes one of the most popular excursion trains in the West, the Ghost Train. From the banks of the Potomac River in historic Cumberland, Maryland, you're going to ride to the top of the mountain on the Western Maryland Scenic Railway. High in the mountains of beautiful British Columbia, through the snows and up the treacherous Cheakamus Canyon to Whistler Ski Resort, you're on board with BC Rail and the Coast Mountaineer. And from the wilds of the Cartwright family's Ponderosa country, Skyfire takes you to the most famous ghost town in the West, Virginia City, where you are going to ride the most famous short line in history, the V&T. Now, it was a popular belief in those days that the steam locomotive was capable of unlimited power and speed. No doubt this was true. Folklore was built around harrowing true stories of runaway trains virtually leaping off the track at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour.
Well, Steve turned around to his black greasy fireman saying, "Shovel in a little more coal." And when we reach that White Oak Mountain, you can really see old 97 roll. Well, it's a mighty rough road from Lynchburg to Danville, and lying on a 3-mile grade. It was on this grade that he lost his air brake, and you see what a jump he made. Said they were going down that mountain making 90 miles an hour when his whistle broke into a scream. Steve was found in the wreck with his hand on the throttle and scalded to death by the steam. Thank you, Gary.
The locomotive we most recognize was the smaller steam engine that helped open our country from east coast to west. Many were built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. Soon the little black engines were placed into service throughout the country in the mining and logging industries out west. In the heavily industrialized east, heavy hauling and passenger service opened such isolated tracks as the New River coalfields of West Virginia. In select places like this short line operation in Virginia City, you can still ride behind the old steam locomotive as it huffs its way up the mountain over the very same line used by the V&T 125 years earlier. But for the most part, all the great old engines were cut up for scrap during World War II. You see, America needed bullets and steel. It was the patriotic thing to do back then, but it took away many of history's classic steam engines, left over from the height of America's industrial age. Coal shifters that once crossed this grand old trestle on Meadow Creek in West Virginia are now just faded images that linger only in the minds of the few who once saw their passing. Their haunting whistles are but a memory that calls down across the shadowy backwoods and hollers. Some of the most classic old steam engines of the West came from the Comstock silver mines of Virginia City. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which was called the V&T for short, was known as the Golden Girl of the short line railroads. The V&T had almost 30 steam locomotives working on less than 100 miles of track. The 56-pound rails were shipped around the Horn of South America from Sheffield, England. History records that one of the first engines was hauled up this steep grade by a 40-hitch team of oxen. Unfortunately, the locomotive got mired down in the mud on this turn.
The story goes that after several days, they couldn't get the locomotive unstuck, and so they left it abandoned right here on this grade until the spring thaw. Such was the way of life in the early West.
The miners, well, they blasted several tunnels into the rock so the V&T could climb the steep grades from Carson City all the way up to Virginia City. The grade was so steep and the turns so sharp, they fitted 72 high-inch drive wheels onto the engines so they could negotiate the sharp turns. These high, classic-looking drive wheels were what undoubtedly saved so many V&T engines from the scrapper's cutting torch. When the rail line closed in 1953, Hollywood studios bought up many of the old engines. They played a starring role in numerous old Western movies. Back in 1862, they didn't have concrete, so they cut these rocks out of quarries and stacked them. They did a darn good job, because here it is 130 years later, and they're still here. You can walk along these old right-of-ways out here in the west and relive that glorious era that was once steam. In select places like this, you can still see the remains of the old V&T trestles down in the canyons. Look at these 12 by 12 beams, soaked in creosote oil for protection from the insects and rotting. They're just as stout now as the day they were lifted into place. Remarkably, these handcrafted trestles still survive from the late 1870s. And though it's almost 125 years old, the same foundation rocks that were laid by hand are just as neatly packed as if the job were done yesterday, thank you. Back then, it was believed that things worth doing were worth doing well. And they did.
It doesn't take a lot of effort to find old buried railroad spikes like this along the right-of-way. You can tell the really old spikes by how thin and slender they are. For some, these spikes have a story all their own. Who knows but what some Gandy dancer chucked this very spike right over his shoulder 130 years ago as they set a new section of track right here in this cut.
Now down in Carson City, they've restored a great deal of the old V&T engines and placed them in a handsome museum for all to see. This old wood burner is called the Inyo. Her brass is spotless to perfection, one of the oldest surviving locomotives. On holiday weekends, they pull the engines out of the roundhouse and run them about on an oval track. Why, they even have an old turntable, once used to turn the engine and tender after it came out of the roundhouse. This old water tower came from one of the service stops in Washoe Valley. There's not too much film that survives from the original V&T, but here we see it as the engineer and fireman turn the engine across the river in Reno. Today, the old turntable's gone. In its place, a lot full of weeds, surrounded by high-rise casinos. And this is the way number 27 looked when it left Reno and crossed the Truckee River. Today, these old concrete piers are all that remain of the old bridge that crossed the river. The motel sits where the tracks used to run. This is the way the roundhouse looked in Carson City before they tore it down. Grover Russell? Now he was the last engineer to pull the final train over the V&T track. And here a lady waved to the train as it crossed the highway at New Washoe City. Today, tourists ride over the V&T right-of-way aboard this short line railroad in historic Virginia City. Many of the old V&T structures, like the Gold Hill Station, have been preserved. Now, this grand structure is St. Mary's of the Mountains, a Catholic church still used today by Virginia City residents. The walls were specially built to withstand vibration. You see, back in the 1870s, they ran the railroad tracks right under the church. The train, well, it passes through this original tunnel that was blasted open by Virginia City miners. Plans are in the works to extend the ride from Virginia City all the way down to Carson City and back. But not all of the giants on the rails were so famous. Back in western Maryland, in a town called Cumberland, they ran a steam operation over the Potomac River and up the mountain to the coal mines. Cumberland was a historic town. It's rumored that the father of our country, George Washington, was known to frequent one of the taverns here in his younger days. Today, you can spend the day just walking about and enjoying the charm of this historic old city. Throughout the spring, summer, and fall, you can ride one of several daily trips from Cumberland Station all the way up the mountain. Sometimes they bring out the old diesels while the steam engine's in service. Now, on this particular occasion, they started out early in the morning at the roundhouse. It was clear that the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad had an abundance of unique old rolling stock. Activity in the yard was brisk, and I can assure you, so was the fall morning chill. They had filled the tender with West Virginia coal right to the top. Then against an autumn sky, they pulled away from the roundhouse. It was fall time, and the colors were magnificent. As they pulled the engine out of the yard for the station, we came upon a slick spot where moisture had left the rails slippery. Steel tires slipping on steel track was a sound that once brought fear to the locomotive engineer. This is very, very hard on the engine. As we approached the station, we came to the Potomac River. I remember thinking that it was pretty thin up here, not very wide. Maybe that's why George Washington was able to throw a silver dollar across it. At the station, we loaded up for the trip up the mountain. Passengers were eager to get on board.
Here we're getting a picture taken. How you doing? Welcome to Cumberland.
And soon we were underway. The town of Cumberland slipping by in the bright, crisp morning air. Now, up in the cab where they do all the work, I was wondering why our fireman Dan was so darn skinny. It was a cinch the engineer sure wasn't. But as we started to climb the mountain, I got a taste of what a fireman's workout was really all about. This narrow gap through the canyon that paralleled the river was called the Narrows. It was relatively flat, but soon we would really begin the climb. The Western Maryland passed through scenic rural country. One of the many highlights of the trip was here at Helmstedter's Curve. Dan the man had his work cut out for him. Oh, the engine was working all right, but from where I stood, it was Dan who was digging his way up the mountain with a shovel. Now, on this particular morning, they decided to give Dan the fireman a little break, so they brought the engine to a stop halfway up the grade. This is the scene Dan was looking for. End of the line, top of the mountain. Frostburg, the Western Maryland Scenic Railway. It's uphill all the way, but guaranteed well worth a nominal charge for admission. You won't be disappointed. From the hills of Maryland, Skyfire traveled to the city by the bay, San Francisco. The Golden Gate Railroad Museum had spent several years restoring a giant engine that had once pulled the longest continuing passenger run of any steam engine in the country. SP 2472 had operated as far east as Ogden, Utah, and back west to the Rail City in Sparks, Nevada. The engine was domiciled in this exceptionally clean shop at the old Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. Like most of the volunteers you'll meet, these men and women were not afraid to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty. Every year, the Golden Gate Railroad Museum took out at least one excursion run from San Francisco. On this particular trip, they were heading out for the San Joaquin Valley for the Dry Bean Festival.
I gotta go get my badge.
The engine, well, it was made ready and pulled out of the yard the day before the run.
He says there's too much travel on the other side.
They pulled out onto the SP main line where a yard goat, an older tug engine, pulled the 2472 down to Daly City. There they would begin a giant ferry move down to San Jose and back up to Oakland. Before being retired from service, the 2472 had pulled daily commuter trains up and down the South Peninsula between San Francisco Station and San Jose. The way the engine was running, this territory was no stranger to the engine. Later in the afternoon, the engine arrived in Oakland, where it tracked down through Jack London Square. The next morning, the engineer opened the cylinder cocks and left for the main passenger terminal. The roadbed followed along the edge of San Francisco Bay as we made our way toward Martinez and the Carquinez Straits. They passed under the Carquinez Bridge and up through the Scenic sugarcane factory. What a sweet trip. Later that afternoon, they turned about for the return trip. Listen to the sound they made as they came back down through the sugar refinery. The Golden Gate Railroad Museum takes several trips each year. You can book a ride. You bet you can. They'd love to have you on board. Besides, your admission is what makes it possible to maintain and run this marvelous steam locomotive. Now, here was a sight I'll never forget. It was an early October morning. We were on one of the most famous lines in the nation. This was part of the old Chessie system, Huntington, West Virginia. Every year, they ran a special excursion train over the CSX main line up the new River Gorge, one of the last primitive pieces of real estate in the eastern United States. The excursion was run by the fine folks who built and restored the 765 locomotive off the old Nickel Plate Road, the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. In the pre-dawn light, volunteers made the engine ready, greasing the bearings and checking over the running gear, brakes, and other critical parts on the locomotive. For this special run, they had rebadged the engine to look like one of the original Chessie engines, number 2765. As the train left Huntington Yard, the cylinder cocks were opened to vent moisture from the chambers so the cold steel wouldn't burst under pressure. Once the steel chambers warmed up, the steam would not condensate into water. That's why you only see this spectacle of steam coming out of the engine when it first makes its run in the mornings. Now, on this particular day, you could cut the fog with a knife. We heard the engine long before we saw it coming. Farther up the line, the fog cleared off a bit. Soon we passed through Charleston, the capital of West Virginia. Now here, the engine was stopped for what could best be described as a lube and oil change. This was the town of Montgomery. The local fire department, well, they turned out all hands to fill the locomotive's water bottle. I took the opportunity to ride a few miles in the cab with the crew. Rich Melvin was the engineer on this part of the trip. Poor old Rich. Little did he plan for the 25 miles of moist, slippery track. For almost an hour, he fought to keep the engine from running away. You've got to have power to climb a hill, but every time he added power, the wheels slipped on the track. Finally, at a picturesque location called Hawk's Nest, we came out of the shadows and got some traction. This is the town of Thurmond. For years, the only road in and out of town was on the railroad. It was not far from here that the legendary John Henry beat the steam drill down in a race to lay track inside the Great Bend Tunnel. As the shadows grew long, the 2765 made the return trip back down New River for Huntington. This is one of the most spectacular excursions in America. If you enjoy spectacular scenery and one of the finest locomotives licensed to get up steam, don't miss your ticket to ride. The fine volunteers at the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society would love to have you on board. Well, there are giants and there are giants. But here is the undisputed giant of the rails. This is the Union Pacific Challenger. It's domiciled at Cheyenne, Wyoming, in a special railroad shop set aside for that purpose. The Union Pacific is to be commended for maintaining and operating such a fine piece of American history. The Challenger is so big, it's like two steam locomotives rolled into one. It was built so the boiler could swing away from the pilot trucks, so the giant engine could negotiate sharp turns. Watch in this turn as the boiler swings to the side. The Union Pacific. They run several excursions each year. The chief operating engineer, the gentleman in charge of running the steam operations, is Steve Lee. Now here we see the locomotive running over the old Western Pacific line north of Portola, California. Inside, the cab is immense. Even with such a giant engine, when it gets up to speed, it's one wild ride inside. Out on the grassy plains of Wyoming, we watched as the engine made her run. The good news is that the Union Pacific takes their fine steam engines all over the country. Space is limited, but you can get a ticket. If you get a chance, don't miss it. They run a first-class operation. On our next stop, Skyfire traveled up to Vancouver, British Columbia. We had been invited to film Terry Ferguson's special wintertime trip on the coast of Mountaineer. This was one of the most scenically beautiful railroads I've ever visited. The rock walls in this country were glaciated thousands of years before during the last ice age. They carved the railroad right-of-way right out of the rock. We were left to hang off the edge of the cliff. There were waterfalls and evergreens everywhere. We followed the engine up the fjord to the town of Squamish. This was the great Northwest country where floats of logs were lagooned before transporting to the mill. we climbed higher toward Whistler Ski Resort, the ground was spotted with snow. It was like a picture postcard. Now this piece of real estate was Cheakamus Canyon. Bar none, the wildest, roughest territory you'll ever run a railroad through. The Coast Mountaineer strained as it climbed up this formidable grade. The Coast Mountaineer makes special excursion runs each year, and you can ride daily over the BC Rail from Vancouver to Squamish and back. You'll never travel a more scenically beautiful piece of America. Now back out on the west coast, we traveled to the remote copper mining town of Ely, Nevada, there to ride on one of the most historically authentic railroads in America. We got to the yard early on a spring morning before sunrise. We poked around the shops to find out what makes an old railroad, and here's what we discovered. This small car was used by the weighmaster to check the accuracy of the railroad scales. Freight was shipped by the pound, just as it is today, so you can bet your bootstraps accuracy was important. Inside the old shops, everything was just as it had been the day the railroad closed. You could still smell the musty, aromatic scent of old leather and canvas. With the sunlight streaming through the panes of glass, it cast an eerie light into the early mist of morning. The stately passenger cars gave off an occasional cracking noise as the wooden coaches expanded in the warmth of the sunlight. There were smoking cars for the gentlemen and non-smoking cars for the ladies, thank you. Such was life back in 1910. The smoking cars had brass match strikers on the wall, leather seats so the ashes wouldn't catch fire, and brass spittoons on the floor for the tobacco juice. Overhead, chandeliers made of Czechoslovakian stained glass hung from empire ceilings. The walls were made of inlaid wood with gold leaf stencil. The engineer, Earl Newb, dropped the Johnson bar forward, cracked the throttle, and those big steam pistons on old number 40 came to life. anticipation was running pretty high in the crew. We've shot a lot of high-speed jet aircraft and mounted our cameras all over the place on classic World War II fighters. But this was my first ride on the front of a hot, dirty, sooty, sweaty, steam-powered locomotive. Was I excited? George Bush, read my lips. I was pumped. Now the train began up a gentle incline that parallels the town of Ely on our left. From the camera inside the high railer that's just in front of the engine, it's a pretty bumpy ride, a lot more than we had imagined. But even with all the vibration, it still provides a marvelous view of the engine. Here comes the tunnel, but we've got problems. The high railer with the camera in the back has got to slow down, or it will jump the tracks inside the tunnel. And that big old 75-ton engine is not slowing down. Let her go! Well, I decided to give the driver of that high railer a little bit of encouragement to get the heck out of the tunnel before we all became hood ornaments on the front of that big old Baldwin locomotive. We're near the top and Copper Flat is in sight. We made it, and the engineer comes off the throttle. The ghost train runs on weekends and holidays. It's a real West experience that's worth the trip. Now we come to the final giant on the rails. This is not the biggest steam engine, but it may well be the most beautiful steam locomotive in the world. The lead-gray skies and the black steel bridge trusses added to the feeling of mystery that each of us felt, as if we were stepping back in time. Black smoke from the boiler lay heavy in the sky over Portland. Pat Tracy was our fireman.
This train train was put together, this locomotive, for the centennial. And volunteers came from all over the country, old steam engine employees with particular skills, and got this running.
It's fun to watch. You'll have a good time. It's great.
The rain clouds had been blown away, and warm sunlight streamed through the windows. There was something indescribably wonderful about riding this train. The clicking of the wheels on the rail, the gentle pitching of the cars had a hypnotic effect. Just around the bend was Oregon City and the Willamette Falls. We were climbing through a tall stand of Douglas fir as the daylight's exhaust erupted into volcano-sized clouds of vapor. We came out of the cut and approached the rural logging camp of West Fir, Oregon. In the center of town was this beautiful old covered bridge. This was to be our final crossing of the Willamette River. Then came the West Fir Tunnel. On the other side would be the town of Oak Ridge. As the daylight pulled into Oak Ridge, Oregon, there were people all along the trackside. Not just the older generation who remembered steam locomotives, but children too. It was remarkable, in this age of lasers, computers, and high-tech wizardry, that a steam engine built in 1938 would bring out so many people to watch her huff and chuff her way proudly into the center of town and into the hearts of those who came to welcome her. These are the giants on the rails, a part of American history. Nothing could stop us. When we were not afraid to accept our destiny as the mightiest nation on the face of the earth. For Skyfire, America's video storyteller, I'm Jim Mitchell. Thank you for watching.